Afternoon, everyone, or I think it's afternoon for all of us now. See some friends from the West Coast for whom it just became the afternoon, I think. Great to see you. We will take a couple minutes just to let some stragglers come in, and then we'll get started relatively quick because want to thank you all for coming on time. Want to respect that. Oh, thanks, Darlene. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, good. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started, or Ellie and I are gonna go ahead and get started, I guess maybe to say, and then we can sort of pick up folks kind of as they come in. So maybe just very, very quick introductions for Ellie and me for those who don't know us yet. I'm Paul Hyrie-Dermuth. I'm part of Bright. And I'm really proud to be part of this Thriving Minds collaborative. So live out here in Holyoke in Western Mass, and yeah, just really feeling grateful today for the opportunity to be with you all and to do some thinking together. So yeah, Ellie.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all here. Thank you all for joining. My name is Ellie Sanchez, and I work as an associate at the Rennie Center. Excited to be here with Paul supporting this session. And then, yeah, we will be sending the slides after for anybody who that question always comes up. So you'll be hearing from me after.
Thanks, that's right. For those of you for whom anyone sees in the chat the question, will these slides be shared? And if we don't get to it, you could feel free to sort of give that response as well. So great. All right. Well, again, hi, everyone. It's a beautiful afternoon here in Massachusetts after a string of not beautiful afternoons. So thanks for all of you who are taking the time to be with us for a Zoom PD session, a Thursday afternoon Zoom PD session, as well as our friends from other states. You know, we've got some good friends from Oregon here with us as well. So just super happy to see you all. Gonna kind of launch right in, and just to say a word or two, just sort of as a reminder. So this is part of specifically the Thriving Minds trauma-informed practice series that we have been blessed to provide with you all. Thriving Minds, again, is a partnership between the Massachusetts School Mental Health Consortium, the Rennie Center, and Bright. And this series is supported by the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma. chunk of you on this call, as you know, you've been in all these sessions, and also you've had coaching support from someone from the Thriving Minds collaborative. So special hello to you all, and welcome to everybody who may be joining on a more a la carte basis. So just to say, so what we'll do today is I'm going to do a super quick review. This is the final kind of long session of this 5-session learning series that we've been doing. Also, I think we'll do fine as a standalone series for those of you joining it as such. But I'm going to do a little review of where we've been, and then we're here to talk about 2 kind of broad things. One is about school culture and trauma responsiveness. So we've talked about a bunch of other things as in terms of trauma and trauma responsiveness. And now we're going to take this bigger picture look at school culture and kind of wet our whistles for thinking about that. And then we're going to talk about adult care and the work of supporting educators. So those are our 2 broad topics before we head to wrapping up. So just to give a sense, these are the 5 sessions the 5 long sessions in this series, the 5 90-minute sessions. We've had some shorter kind of specific topic sessions along the way, but this has been the linked series. So we did an introduction, then we looked at kind of tier 1, so school-wide and classroom practices, and then we looked at tiers 2 and 3, the kind of supports that happen outside of classroom instruction and at more intensive levels. Then we looked at teaming, screening, and data, what we sort of think of as the infrastructure for trauma-informed work in schools. And today, again, we're kind of going to wrap things up with talking about school culture more broadly, and then supporting educators as we think systemically about this work. So just as a little bit of a review, for those of you who have been along, I think we've shown this slide in pretty much every one of the sessions that we've done. So our team, both in Bright and also our Thriving Minds team, is pretty into the work of Dr. Bruce Perry, who we feel like has really informed this conversation, along with a bunch of other folks around trauma and trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed schools. So in this notion of working to shift our perspective from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and also really thinking about what we can do to help. So in light of the impact of trauma on the brain and really on the body. So yeah, and then perhaps our most commonly used Dr. Perry slide, again, this notion that as we work with kids and also as we work with adults, right, as we work with anyone, this idea that in order to reach the parts of our brain that can allow us to really engage in reasoning and reflection, we need to start with regulating both the input that's coming from inside of our bodies as well as the input that's coming from the outside world. So we need to regulate in order to be able to relate, in order to be able to reason and reflect. And this is really the broad work of what it means to be trauma informed at the broadest level. We think is really internalizing and taking this way of approaching our work into every corner of our schools. So, and then this is a poem that one of our teammates sort of had shared. I'm going to read it just as a reminder. So, we are not in the business of fixing or resolving trauma. We're not that powerful, but we can help heal. We can facilitate growth, and we can remind people of their inherent worth, that they're not the problem, it's not their fault, and therefore mitigate the devastating impacts of trauma. So just wanted to share that to invite you all into this conversation today. So as a reminder, in our first session, the introduction session, these are the pieces that we shared, defining trauma, really looking at the question of prevalence and thinking about the stress response system, symptoms and impact of trauma, including the impact of trauma on learning, sort of like setting the frame for then, this is sort of what the challenge is and how do we address it in a healing-centered way. So then in the second and third sessions, we took a deep dive into what some of this work might look like in schools using the MTSS framework. So beginning with tier 1, we looked at the notion of both school-wide practices, so things like core social-emotional learning curricula, also school-wide activities, and then really recognizing that identifying students who need additional supports, who need tier 2 and tier 3 supports, is actually a critical tier 1 activity. So this notion of whether that's through universal screening, whether it's through a really well-developed referral systems, just that piece. And then those of you who are with us will remember John Crocker took us through a pretty deep dive into this trauma-sensitive classroom kind of kit that he had put together, looking at these, I guess it's maybe 10 or 11 standards or practice areas, a really pragmatic way for folks who are particularly at the classroom level to assess their own practice and really look at the ways in which classroom practice already is trauma informed and healing oriented, and maybe some areas where there could be some growth, right? And so so that was sort of like that session, and I know a lot of folks who participated found a lot of value because the teams we've been coaching, many have wanted to really take that and apply it back into your own schools. Then in the third session, we looked at tier 2 and tier 3. So just a reminder that these are some of the specific interventions at tier 2 that we talked through and that John shared with us, trauma-informed evidence-based practices. And just a couple of considerations as reminders from that tier 2 conversation. First of all, we do think it's important to distinguish something that's a mental health intervention, maybe that's an approach like CBITS or something like that, that is an evidence-based practice related to trauma versus an SEL intervention. And there are plenty of excellent SEL interventions out there at tier 2. I think many of us are familiar, for example, with check-in, check-out, just to recognize that there is a distinction between a social-emotional learning intervention and a trauma-informed mental health intervention, and kind of similar with groups, right? Because something is a tier 2 group doesn't necessarily make it an intervention focused on supporting kids who have experienced trauma, right? So, and then secondly, just that consideration that when we think about counseling, whether at the group or individual level, there is a difference between kind of mostly responsive, kind of responding in the moment to what kids are bringing versus approaches that are evidence-based, that are more goal-oriented and focused, right? So just thinking about that. And then thirdly, the importance of recognizing the potential power of evidence-based interventions, but also that we really do need to think about the cultural context and cultural relevance. So as we think about selecting and getting good at tier 2 interventions, those are some considerations. Then when we looked at tier 3 in that same session, we recognized or sort of also thought about kind of 3 parts of tier 3. And just again, as a reminder, a little activator, a few considerations that we talked about in that session. So first of all, just that as we think about critical incident or crisis response, that the kind of the level of organization and kind of the quality of policies and protocols, how we put teams together, how we access external resources is a critical consideration for making it really effective work versus work that, as John sort of mentioned, can sometimes be associated with what can feel like directionless pressure, right? So, and then secondly, we talked a little bit about the BRIGHT model as one approach to another kind of common tier 3 need, which is how do we support students who have had a significant disruption associated with a traumatic experience in their learning? How do we support them in being able to access school again effectively, both academically and in terms of the other supports that they need? And then finally, we talked about special education, which, you know, is a third place where students who have experienced significant trauma often find themselves. And this question of wanting to make sure that therapeutic special education programs are really therapeutic and are really trauma informed. So thinking about what does instructional practice look like in a program like that, and to what degree are the therapeutic supports truly therapeutic and trauma informed. So again, just a quick run through. In the last session, those of you who were present, you may remember this pretty stunning slide from John Crocker. Just as a reminder, he introduced the notion that there are a lot of acronyms and a lot of different sort of systems kind of floating around there. And part of maybe the holy grail for some of us right now is figuring out how do they fit together. So he talked about the notion of an integrated systems framework and wanting to make sure that, again, we're really clear about all of the interventions and supports that we're working to implement, where they fit within a wider system in our school. So, and also the importance of kind of integrated use of data as a critical part of the practice. So, and then we talked about some of the infrastructural pieces associated with trauma-informed and healing-centered work. So partnerships with some thoughts and questions about how to develop partnerships and how to assess our partnerships, thinking about people, non-academic staff who are often the folks who are kind of the key folks doing work around and related to trauma and trauma responsiveness. So thinking about the identification of those positions and again, how they're organized. This really critical notion of teams, the importance of teams, well-organized and highly effective teams in making sure that we are able to respond appropriately and develop trauma-informed and healing-centered practice in our schools. And then, finally, again, the use of data, recognizing that there are multiple sources of data, and we want to be using multiple sources of data and kind of checking them with and against each other as a critical part of our practice in order to make our supports as effective and comprehensive as possible. So that was like a really quick kind of run through. We wanted to just kind of reactivate what we've been doing. And I want to give you just a couple of minutes in a small breakout to talk and just, again, activate and think about these questions. So I will put them in the chat. I think may be the easiest way to go. All right, chat everyone. These are the questions. And then I'm going to put you in breakout rooms for just a few minutes as a chance to activate or reactivate your thinking and learning. And we will see you back after you've had a chance to talk with a few others about these questions. So see you in maybe like 4 minutes. Jane, are you able to access? I
cannot anymore.
Okay, I wonder what happened. Let's see.
Jane, you should be able to see a button at the bottom that says breakout rooms.
But it looks like also
Oh.
that you would be by yourself. I'm gonna move you to a different group, Jane,
Okay,
just in case. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Tim.
Hey there. I'm in between places, so I'm just trying to get on for as much of the meeting as I can make here.
No worries.
How are you?
I am feeling overall fortunate. Yes. Yeah.
Good.
All right. I think we have everybody back from that, from the breakouts. Thanks, everyone. And I think we'll move forward. And my goal is for you all to have some other good chances and maybe a little more time to talk with folks in small groups as we introduce some new content going forward. So welcome back. I'm gonna start sharing screen again. And I have been really thinking about this question. So we promised and want to deliver on a session that includes a consideration about school culture after, we just looked at, a review of these other sessions where we went into quite a level of detail and weeds, quite frankly, around, interventions and supports at different levels and how we're organized and, sort of like all of that. But there's this big complex question, right, about school culture, sort of like more broadly. And I think it's a really interesting question, right? So just to activate that and a question of like, so then what would be a trauma-informed and healing-centered school culture, right? So just as a beginning part, I think then the first question is like, what actually is school culture? And I would really love to hear or read kind of different folks' thoughts, like what comes to mind when you think about school culture, or what do you mean, or what do you think people mean when we say the word school culture? So wondering if folks would be willing to kind of unpack that. So thanks, Craig. So the feeling in the air. Yep, so Marie, the feeling again you get when you're in the building. Here's what others' thoughts. Like, what do you think, what do you mean, or what do you think people mean by school culture? The way we're able to expect it to exist in a space. Thanks, Grace. How do actions align with values? Yep. Overtones, agreed upon norms, student comfort, Yep, shared language and responses and understandings of events. Oh, interesting. Yep, so the the physical setting, yeah, interpersonal connections. Yeah, thanks, Christina. Shared expectations, norms, and mores. Thanks, Pat. Yep, on how to address behavioral challenges and maybe many other things. Question of trust. Thanks, Carolina. Ruth, the nonverbal and verbal environment. Yep, non-verbalized norms and values. Interesting, right? And let's see, I know some of them are coming in quick. So, yeah. Great. All right, I apologize. I think I must have balanced between collegial and congenial relationships. Yeah, so lots of great things here. You all can read the chat for yourself. So I just want to be clear, I do not claim to be a school culture expert by any means. And this is a question of genuine, a genuine question for me as much it is maybe for or more than for some people, as much for many and as much for more people. So I went and I just looked at a few folks, in some cases well-known folks like Michael Fullan, if you look at this quote, and see what they had to say about school culture. So Fullan says, school culture can be defined as the guiding beliefs and values evident in the way a school operates. That really resonates with what some of you shared, right? And also he says school culture can be used to encompass all the attitudes, expected behaviors, that's interesting, right? And values that impact how the school operates. So that's Fullan. And then this was from Peterson. So want to read at least highlights of this. I like this one. The set of norms, values, and beliefs, rituals and ceremonies, thought that was interesting, symbols and stories that make up the persona of the school. And they note that these unwritten expectations build up over time, right? So they're not fully controllable, right? So yeah, and then the example, this was from a staff development journal. So just perhaps, as we might expect, you know, here's a piece about then kind of one part of school culture is this set of expectations, what actually gets talked about at staff meetings, what is good teaching, how willing is the staff to change, what is the culture around, what is the culture, what is the importance of staff development, right? So I thought that was interesting. Then of course there's this question of people talk about school climate, right? And then the question of how does climate relate to culture? So this is a fairly well-known, I would say, at the federal level, sort of model around school climate. So kind of taking an analytical approach, right? So breaking it down into engagement, safety, and environment, and then breaking it down into further sub-factors. So, you know, this question of these being the things that I guess, according to this view, are constitutive of school climate, whether there's whatever a good school climate would be or not as good school climate, that these would be the things, the indicators that would kind of collectively make up school climate. So that is interesting, right? And then just finally, this is a British team that's involved in a participatory action research project with folks in schools. And as they talked, they identified kind of these broad, what they call dimensions. So these structural and contextual factors, and then what they call the academic and organizational dimension, the community dimension, interestingly, again, similar to what some of you said, right? The quality of the relationships across stakeholders in the school, and then safety and support. So I feel like you all were great, right? Each of you who shared sort of like different pieces that are certainly within the universe of what folks who study this are talking about in terms of school culture. So again, you may have or find other kind of definitions or ways of describing school culture that work even better for you. I'm not here to pretend that I have the right one or that any of these folks have it exactly right, but just wanted to kind of get us in the same sphere of thinking about things, because then I think the question becomes, in our own schools, as we start to think about this, what are some examples of specific indicators of school culture in your school or a school that you work with? So think specifically about your school or a school you work with. Think about what do you see or experience that gives you information about the norms and values, beliefs of the school? How physically is the school building organized, or what are the physical aspects of the school building that point to the culture? What about who works in the school might tell you, what does that tell you about the culture of the school? How about the expected behaviors? And I'm thinking about expected behaviors as much or more on the part of adults as of kids. Certainly the expected behaviors of kids are an important part of school culture, but how about the expected behaviors of adults? Rituals and ceremonies, symbols and stories. So just let's get some real live examples of what are some things that point to school culture in the schools that you all are familiar with. Oh, thanks, Pat. The staff lounge. Yep. Teacher workroom conversations. Oh, new picnic tables for outdoor eating. Oh, yeah. These are great examples. Murals. Yeah. Oh, inclusive murals. Thanks, Peggy. That people greet each other. Yeah. Thanks, Tara. Yep. Oh yeah, thanks, Christina. So what things look like, right, when difficult things happen or when there are difficult conversations. Yeah, so that significant indicator of school culture. Restorative circles, yeah. Darlene, yeah, how students and teachers talk about each other in their school. Oh yeah, thanks, Katie. So administrative support or lack of, an important part of the culture of the school. Opportunities to engage with own identities. Openness and compassion for students in distress, yep, would be an important indicator of the culture of a school. Tie-dye day, yep. Signature practices in adult meetings. Laughter, yep. Laughter, yeah, interesting. Thanks, Jen. Thinking about what do we see when we see staff interacting in the hallways? What does that tell us about the culture of the school? Cornhole competition. Thanks, Karen. Yeah. So yeah, interesting, right? These informal examples that you're all coming with. Yeah, Ruth, yes, the entrance of the school, how you're greeted. Oh, the school food, yeah. Oh, when people are invited to have input on professional development. Yep. Really interesting to think about all of these as what do they tell us about the culture of the school? Yeah. Yep, that's right, Faye. So are there social emotional lessons and what do they look like and what does that tell us about the culture of the school? Yeah. Again, these are great examples. Thanks everyone. I think what I'm just what I'm just going to do briefly, I was thinking about a few examples. So I'm just going to shut off the screen of things that I've seen lately, just for whatever they're worth, and see if any of these resonate with you all. Like, I've been thinking about one thing that, particularly in a lot of high schools, I feel like sports are a really important part of the culture, and you sort of like see that everywhere, right? So you see it in the clothes that kids and adults are wearing. You see it in what's in the school entrance, you know, sort of, et cetera, right? And so like the indicators, you see it in actually like many of the interactions that folks are having, the notion that like sports are really important here, and sports are an important part of the school culture. to pick up on something that Ruth said. Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, that was one I thought about too. I have the chance to visit a lot of schools, and the question of like what it's like to enter a school is so powerful. Both like just what it's like to park, what it's like to get into the door, how you're greeted, what that whole process looks like. It can feel like a really important indicator about what's important and what the culture is at that school. I want to say there's a school that I've had the chance to work with, a high school, and they have this concept of the long blue line, which is, it really connects the school with the entire, it's a high school, with the entire history of the school. So they say that as kids come into that school, they sort of inherit and they become part of the long blue line. It's a school with blue in its colors, and that it's connecting it with the long history and tradition of the school, which I think is really interesting, right? So it's a school where it feels like there's a really high value on the past as a really important part of the culture of that school. So that was one that I was thinking about. I was in a school last week where everywhere you went, there was some indication related to Black Lives Matter. And so just really, really interesting, sort of in classrooms, in the hallways, so that I thought was an interesting, indicator. Yeah, and then just want to show you to affirm our friends from Oregon out there. So this is a T-shirt that from Silver Rail Elementary School that my teammates and I happened to be gifted when we were there out there, and that's the school putting on the T-shirt what they're trying to value and the culture that they're trying to create. So just that, like, that was an interesting one as well. So just want to say, as you all have shared, there are a lot of different ways that what counts as the culture of the school gets indicated, and how important that is, right? So as we think about how we can understand school culture. So with that in mind, then here is the next question, which is, what does a trauma responsive, healing centered school culture, what comprises that? What is that experience like for kids, for adults, for everyone involved sort of in the school? So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that in many ways then, if we say norms, values, and beliefs, the physical aspects of the building, the staff, expected behaviors, rituals and ceremonies, symbols and stories, and other pieces, if those are huge parts of what indicate the culture of the building, then presumably in a trauma-informed, healing-centered school culture, we would experience things that, these things in ways that are trauma-informed and healing-centered. So this question, what comprise trauma-informed and healing-centered norms for a school? What does a building, a trauma-informed, healing-centered school building look and feel like from a physical experience? What are the expected behaviors of adults and of kids, but really, if we think about adults in a trauma-informed and healing-centered school building, what are going to be the rituals and ceremonies in a school with a trauma-informed and healing-centered culture? And what are the kinds of symbols and stories that people would hold on to in a school with a trauma-informed and healing-centered culture? So that's a genuine question for me. And I'm wondering if folks will indulge me with one more round in the chat to say, now let's take a look at this and say, what would you see as examples? They may already exist in your school culture, or they may be things that you could imagine and would really like to see in your school culture or in the culture of a school that would be examples, in these areas of trauma responsiveness and a healing-centered focus for the culture of that school. Like what would that look like? So please in the chat, if you don't mind, share some examples. Restorative conversations. Thanks, Kevin. Predictable routines. Yep. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, Jen. Inclusive practice. Establish safe spaces. Balance between structure and flexibility. Movement breaks. Processing time. Yeah, interesting, right? Folks reconnecting with some of those classroom indicators that we saw. A consistent neutral consequence system. Noise considerations. Yeah, thanks, Colleen. That PBIS is really well thought out. Yeah, thank you, Fila. Composure and relational conversations. A lot of literacy around feelings, language, affective questions, and check-ins. Yep, break spaces. Relationship building. Thanks, Maria. Awareness of tone of voice, body, and language. Curiosity on how teachers approach students. Yeah, sounds like quiet spaces and break spaces seem like pretty important, pretty concrete indicator. Yep. Yep, opportunities to regulate. Thanks, Tara. Stacy, yep, ongoing conversations, yep, between, yeah, so that family engagement piece as a really important part of trauma-informed healing-centered culture. Great, all right, well, yep, crisis response training, yeah, absolutely. So, yep, consistent professional development, yeah, thank you, Kevin, yeah. And it's interesting because I think as we all think about, in many ways, like professional development is like right there at the heart of the matter. And then it's an interesting question. We absolutely need ongoing professional development about trauma-informed and healing-centered practice. And as we work to build trauma-informed healing-centered culture, in addition to excellent professional development, what else do we need? And that feels like, that feels for me like a really important question about the question of culture and culture building in our schools. So, so I have been thinking, you know, again, as I just said, professional development is critical. And then this other question, if we're committed to building trauma-informed, healing-centered cultures in our schools, what else is needed? And recognizing this is a matter of leadership. And certainly it's a matter of what the building leader does and says about this is really, really important, right? There's no question about that. Sometimes as they say, you know, as goes the principal, so goes the school, right? There's just, there's no question. But also there are lots of other leaders in schools. And, you know, so it's an interesting question, right? What can leaders and leaders at different levels do in addition to professional development? And so some of what the literature that I did have a chance to review sort of said is, first of all, one of the things that folks do is they pay explicit attention to the culture. They think about the culture and they think, if we are trying to build a trauma-informed and healing-centered culture, then what are we doing? Yes, we're providing professional development, and what else are we doing? And that's an explicit, not only an implicit matter of attention for folks. And then that leads to then saying, what does it mean if trauma-informed healing-centeredness is a core value at our school? What does it mean to act on that value? And what are the norms we need to change, and how can we change them? So there's explicit work to do that. Hiring decisions, right? Who are we hiring? And what does that say about this commitment? The importance of really clear public messages about expected behaviors. Often schools are much better at that with regard to expected behaviors of kids, but the question of expected behaviors of adults, right, feels just really critical. So we're helping adults learn how to engage in trauma-informed healing-centered practice, and then we're setting the expectation that they do it, right? Making changes in the physical plant. Really then thinking this interesting question, what are the rituals and ceremonies that we need in our schools in order to make them trauma-informed and healing-centered? Certainly, restorative practice, restorative circles feels like one really important part of that, wondering if there are others sort of beyond that. And then what are the symbols and stories that we want to bring into place to really say, our culture is a culture that values effective trauma responsiveness. Our culture is a culture of healing, right? And I just want to note that when I was a school leader, I have to just say, I spent a lot of time early on trying to think like, how could I change people's belief systems around certain things? And I had a mentor who said one of the most powerful things I've sort of ever heard in my career, which is, the goal is to change the practices and let the beliefs come along. That it is really hard to change people's beliefs. So, but the goal is change the practices. So I think what culture leaders do in schools is work to figure out how are we changing practices to bring people's beliefs. And then finally, investing in the well-being of our adults. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of this session on before too long. But just one final piece that I want to give you the chance to do. And I'm going to, again, kind of put challenge you to talk beyond professional development. I would say we all agree that there's a need, as Kevin said, for initial and ongoing effective professional learning, professional development for adults around trauma-informed healing-centered practice. But beyond that, what are the other elements that are needed in your school or the schools you work of physical schools? So that's in a brief way what we would say. So, all right, I am going to put you in rooms again. I'm going to make them a little bigger this time. And say like, we will see you in maybe 7 or 8 minutes to give you the chance to talk about your own schools from this perspective.
being recorded.
All right, I think we have everyone back. Welcome back, and again, hope those were helpful conversations for you all. I think happy to hear thoughts if folks have anything in the chat that you'd from your group that would be helpful for the larger group to share. Please feel free to pop that in. I'm going to move forward in the interest of time with this last part of this session. So I guess the first thing I want to just say is this last part are things that my guess is there are very few folks who have not participated in one way or another in a session that touches on many of these points over the last year or so, because these have been ongoing and really important conversations that have happened. So if this is sort of not so new for you, I think what I'm going to ask you to do is kind of think at the meta level about two questions. And one is, how am I doing for myself with some of these things? And then secondly, how are we doing in my school or district at this point with some of these things? And so, yeah, so just want to say that might be just sort of like a checkpoint and a little bit of a reminder for many of us sort of on this call. So just as a starting point, then when we think about, this question of the kinds of cultures, the kinds of schools we want to have, when we want to have schools that are really, we can really proudly say are trauma informed and healing centered, then we do, for instance, work with this kind of well-known recognition at this point that kids will do well if they can, right? A piece that we're working to shift that mindset away from kids will do well if they want to. And we also then have to think about adults, and we work with this quite famous phrase at this point from Dr. Perry, right? So a dysregulated adult will struggle to regulate a dysregulated student. So if we want our students to be regulated, we need our adults to be regulated, and it's not easy to be regulated right now, right? So just to recognize that there is a certain amount of stress or tension that's helpful and optimum for us, and then there is a point at which the curve, we hit the top of the curve, and then it gets worse instead of better sort of after that in terms of the amount of stress and tension that we're managing. And again, another quite famous Bruce Perry sort of graphic here, right? So this notion of the pattern of stress, that really, really good, healthy stress, when it's predictable, when it's moderate, when it's controllable, that helps us to grow. It helps us to become, to be able to tolerate more and become more effective in whatever it is that we're working on. When stress becomes unpredictable, extreme, prolonged, then what happens is we start to become super sensitized to it and beginning to get into this unhealthy stress reaction cycle, right? So, and that we've been dealing with a pretty intense kind of day-to-day, moment-to-moment, cumulative traumatic thing, which is this pandemic. And we've got that in addition to all of the super stressful things that are happening at the national level in our country, and the things that are happening in our own lives, right? So this is a really hard time, and we know it's a really hard time in the lives of educators. So, and as one of my colleagues sort of has noted, when we think about this like ongoing uncertainty and just the sort of just everything that's happened over the past 2+ years now, just recognizing like there was a beginning, right? How things were for us at the very beginning of the pandemic and kind of what that was like, right? And felt like there were some positive things about that. Then we can look back and think what the sort of middle period was like, right? And then really start thinking about as it becomes prolonged and it starts to feel like, is this ever going to end? Then what the sort of experience of that is like for us and how hard that gets, right? And so thinking about the adults that we're working with, maybe thinking about ourselves and where we are, on this scale, and thinking about how many of us are managing the kinds of experiences and feelings that are coming along with prolonged exposure. So my amazing teammate Courtney has shared this quote. So from Bing Crosby of all people, right? But the idea that just about anyone can face a crisis. It's the everyday living that's rough, right? And I think like that's the moment that we're in, and that so many of our peers and colleagues are in right now. Really, really having a hard time with the everyday living as we work in our schools. So another kind of metaphor that we've used for this is the notion of surge capacity, right? Which, as we know, certainly we used in the world of electronics and the delivery of electricity, but also thinking about that in the healthcare world, and the ability to sort of like respond to, kind of really intensive demand, right? So the surge capacity of a system, let's say of the healthcare system, let's say of school systems, and let's say of our own systems, right? So what happens with surge capacity? We pull up certain resources when things get really stressful, right? And they were never designed to be there for long periods of time, or for us to use them for long periods of time. But unfortunately, it's starting to feel for lots of folks like we've been at surge capacity for a really long time, and that is not how our systems were designed, right? So these are just some examples from some teacher kind of blogs and websites and things that we've taken about kind of where things are and where educators have been sort of during this last couple of years. So what happens, right, when folks are expected to operate at surge capacity levels for these really long periods of time? Again, these are the kinds of experiences that we start to have. And, these are the kinds of things, we'll maybe talk a little bit more about this, but that begin to be associated with burnout, right? And so, which is a really significant challenge. So just gonna give you all one more brief small group conversation. Just talk for a moment about yourselves and this question of how this notion of surge capacity is, how that compares to your experience during the pandemic, and then secondly, what that's been like for you. So popping those questions, we'll have a real brief remix of our breakout rooms and just give you a chance to just check in and talk about this notion of surge capacity. So here we go. We'll see you in maybe 3 or 4 minutes.
Being recorded.
All right, thanks and welcome back, everyone. And just want to kind of wrap up with just talking a little bit about adult care kind of at the kind of systemic or school-wide level, and then a little bit at the personal level. So how do we address ourselves, and how do we address others in our communities? The reality that some folks may be really struggling with this notion of being at surge capacity for way too long. So just first of all, kind of pragmatically at the leadership level, want to just say, first of all, it's really important when leaders, and again, certainly thinking about like people with positional institutional power, but also thinking that each of us really is a leader in our own spheres, and how important it is for each of us to be thinking about these things. Thinking about how talking about educator trauma, I think sometimes we can get stuck in talking, really attending to kids' trauma, but recognizing that, educators are being explicitly intentional about recognizing that educators are having traumas in their own lives, and also are often experiencing sort of secondary or vicarious trauma from what kids are going through. So kind of really publicly acknowledging that and thinking about how to address it. Secondly, adult care looks like making it possible for educators to get mental health care, right? And that means like really working to think about how can we reduce systemic barriers. So making it possible that folks can access it during school hours instead of trying to press into early morning or after school time only, which can potentially make it more stressful rather than less stressful for folks to try to get mental health care? Is it possible to make on-site mental health care possible for adults as well as for kids? And where there are barriers around insurance, other pieces, having our systems and pushing our HR systems to really help with that. So that one feels really important. Creating and making it possible for educators to safely process together, right? And again, that means potentially saying it can feel like staff meeting and team meeting and professional learning time can feel so precious. And on the other hand, we are sending really important messages with the ways we organize and use that time. To loop back to the question about school culture, if we want to think about creating a trauma-informed and healing-centered school culture, then the notion that the ways that adults spend time together is just really, really critical as an indicator of that. So creating that space and that time. And then finally, really important for leaders to help and support educators in setting boundaries, often by setting boundaries themselves. So just want to call that out, and just want to ask the question, sort of like ask for folks in the chat, can you share some examples where in your own leadership you've been trying to do this, or you've seen other leaders work to promote adult care? Just want to hear about the things that are happening out there, so folks can hear from others about the good work that's happening. Checking in. Oh, Headspace descriptions. That's amazing. Being allowed to leave early for appointments. Yeah.
Letting them cross the road, Darcy. We had to let an ambulance by, right? Because some
Boundaries. Thanks, folks. I'm following and reading. So you have goodie bags. It's nice to have flexible as possible with self-care requests. Central office community of care committee. Yeah. Scheduling emails during working hours. Yeah, Lisa, I appreciate that. I feel like that's, I need to get better at that. Yeah. Oh, a joy hour. Yeah, thanks, Tara. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thanks, folks. All right. So, all other pieces about this being welcome to be shared in the chat. So, just want to say, you know, these like leadership moves are really, really critical. And then finally, you know, just want to say that, of course, there are structural supports that folks need, and then there's what we do and how we take care of ourselves and each other at the personal level, and knowing that that's the place that in the end it all comes down to. So I think what I'm going to do, just recognizing the time, it does not make sense to try to burn really fast through a whole set of slides. And again, I think things that maybe most of you, I think, may have encountered at one point or another along the way. Want to recognize that, first of all, this is a slide that we really love, and we'll be sharing the slide deck. There's a whole bunch more slides sort of in here that relate to sort of like personal care for self and others. We really like this slide. If you look, the notion of like what's a burnout cycle and versus what's a wellness culture, if you see the sort of, there's a kind of one-to-one match, right? Between each of the smaller circles sort of on here. So really, really love this and suggest it as something that we can use in our buildings and we can share with each other to think like, to what degree are we practicing a wellness culture in our school? To what degree are we stuck in a burnout cycle? And just want to say that when we think for our team about the kind of pieces of what counts as sort of helping to work our way through this like maxed out, this like this sort of place of burnout cycle, these are the broad pieces that we think about. So how we nourish wellness, both for ourselves and with others, how we complete the stress response cycle. So sort of when we think about kind of getting stuck on an emotion, so we're experiencing stress and it's coming through in a certain emotion and then we sort of get stuck there. How do we complete that cycle? How do we get ourselves out of what can feel like a loop around something that is stressing us out? There's this notion of a balanced mind plate, again, that we will, that's there and available. What does it really mean to have a balanced mind in our lives? How do we prioritize what's most important? And then really, what does it mean to set and stick with boundaries? And as I said, rather than kind of like trying to run through details about all of this, I think what might makes the most sense is to just say to you all, I will share these slides with everyone who signed up, and glad, love that lunch on the stoop, Jen. I think the very best thing that maybe I can do for you at this point is say again, rather than bombarding you with a whole bunch of slides about things that you've seen before, maybe we'll wrap a little bit early today and say the resources will be there to use as you see fit. And let's take 9 minutes and put it in our pocket and do something good and possibly self-careful with. And wishing all the best. Thanks for everyone for joining us today. I'll stick around in case anybody wants to talk or check in about anything in particular. And just wishing you all the very best as we wrap up this school year. Excited to see those of you that were coaching in the coaching meetings.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks. I'm glad I was able to be part of this last one. I wasn't able to do any of the other ones. I'm an elementary school counselor and trauma is my specialty. And as we were going through this, realizing more and more that I don't have a lot of special ed specific techniques or practices. They're more general, which is what we try to do, is to provide to everybody. But is there a program or a site or anything that you can send me to that includes a little bit more of that specialized population care?
So meaning, are you thinking about like supports and things for kids where there's a documented something like a social-emotional disability or something like that? Or yeah, so just curious, yeah.
More of just the academic side, because if we're having trouble processing things, or we're, obviously we're not going to use books if there's a reading difficulty as much, but and trying to hone in on these specific populations that maybe don't get as much attention because people tend to think that it's disability based rather than trauma based.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because I think to your point, in some ways, this whole question of when in fact, like what the child really needs is support working through a trauma response. And that's different from sort of like a lifetime disability, but how often that gets, sort of like mislabeled. So it's interesting because I think what we tend to point to folks toward is some of those what would not necessarily be called special education interventions, but would be called like highly effective, trauma response interventions. And so some of that is thinking about like those evidence-based practices that I was touching on a little bit when we were talking about tier 2, like trauma-informed CBT or CBITS or bounce back, like those kind of group PD kind of supports and interventions. And then some of that is also a little bit about thinking just about classroom practice. And so if it'd be helpful, what I'd be super happy to do is share both like the slides and then some of the tools from those sessions where we really looked at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 interventions.
That would be great.
So yeah, and then if you want to take a look at those, and then really happy to like, have a follow-up by email or follow-up conversation or something like that. And so, yeah. And, I'll also say the other piece, just so that what we've been doing with the schools and the districts that we've been coaching is we've been having them use as a starting point. Are you familiar with the SHAPE system?
Not significant.
Okay, so the SHAPE system is this really, really big, amazing kind of product out of the University of Maryland Center for School Mental Health. And it's all kinds of things, Katie. Like there's a million different resources there related to school mental health, assessment tools, and sort of support and intervention to all these different sort of pieces. So just in itself, like I really recommend that as a resource. But then secondly, they do have a smaller, like, it's called the TRSIA. It's a brief, about a 20-minute assessment of kind of where a school stands around trauma-informed practice, sort of like school-wide. And we've had sort of a bunch of schools that we've been coaching kind of take that as a starting point assessment and then use that as kind of like a way to think, okay, how do we, target and focus our efforts? So I feel like I'll send you like, it's like, I'd love to get your email and then I'll send you, a set of those resources right now. And then also what I will say is, as I said, it's interesting because in some ways, rather than think like, let's try to duplicate in the form of specialized instruction, some of whatever, let's really look at like, what are the like just really strong practices that I'm sure you're already engaged with, in trauma informed, and then how do we just use those with kids, who may have been misdiagnosed,
Right.
so for instance, with a disability when really, it's a trauma response. And so, yeah, so I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's where my mind went.
It is. Thank you. Do you want me to just put my email in the chat here?
That would be lovely.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so NMRSD, like like I know your district. I'm just trying to remember.
Sure. North Middlesex Regional.
North Middlesex. Okay, great. NMRSD. Yeah, I will put those. I will put the decks from a couple of the other sessions. I will put the trauma-informed classroom practice self-assessment that we had shared as well. All kind of like those links or those documents in an email to you. And then, like I said, if there's other pieces where you have follow-up questions or anything like that, then you'll have my email, and then we can take things from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Katie. Take good care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.